Let's get into the debate uncensored now, and it's all about the National Prosecuting Authority, which recently released a lengthy statement breaking its silence since the release of Part 1 of the Zondo Inquiry Report, which found in part that the Prosecuting Authority failed to respond adequately to the state capture cases. Now, the body says its new dedicated task force will urgently address prosecutions of those implicated in the report. For more on this, we are joined now by the organization Undoing Tax Abuse Executive Director, Stefanie Fick. We're also joined by the former Director of National Prosecuting Authority, that's Advocate Menzi Simelane. And we had also hoped to be joined by the former NPA head of Asset Forfeiture Unit, Willie Hofmeyr. Unfortunately, he is unable to make it. However, we do have the New York Law School professor, that's Penelope Andrews. To all of you, thank you so much for making the time for this important conversation. Let me start with you, Advocate Simelane. Your considered view, please, on whether there will be a major difference between the new task force that has now been set up to deal with the state capture cases versus what the investigative directorate, which was set up some 3 years back now, which has been dealing with the state capture cases. What do you think the major difference will be between these two entities, if you like, if any at all?
Thank you very much, Oli, and to the other guests as well. I don't think there'll be a difference. There should not be a difference anyway, but I doubt that there will be a difference. The ID is a structure that's created specifically within the NPA to conduct the business of investigations. And it is capacitated accordingly in terms of the relevant documents that establish it. A task force generally, in any circumstances, is really a combination of a skilled set of people whose task is to perform, obviously, whatever they are asked to do, but they would tend to be more issue specific. So a task team would generally have different skills, and each member of the task team would be designated to attend to a specific issue, bring that information back to the bigger team, and then that team will, if it's empowered to even make decisions, will make decisions, but ordinarily will give recommendations to the decision makers somewhere on the task that they've been given. So I don't think there will be a difference at all.
Stefanie Fick, if you read some of today's newspapers, there is one article which talks about widespread panic that is setting in among members of the investigative directorate because the allegation or the report says that they worry that the ID basically could be a thing of the past. In your view, is this the purpose of this new task force, and that is to swallow the investigative directorate?
I also don't. I don't understand what will be accomplished by doing that. In the sense that, what do we want? We want to resource the NPA in order to do what they are supposed to do, and part of that is to now look at prosecutions, investigations and prosecutions, and getting some of that state capture criminals behind bars. Whether a task team versus the ID is at all going to make a difference if you are not going to give them, again, resources meaning money and people in order to fulfill their mandate. I am not so sure that by, just cleaning the table and starting all over again, without rectifying the mistakes you made in the past, in other words, not enough investigators, not enough prosecutors, whether a task team is necessarily going to make a difference. They had ample opportunity to start at least to make a difference. We are all wondering why we haven't seen any state capture prosecutions. It doesn't mean that people weren't working hard behind the scenes. I am sure that that there are colleagues that worked their hands to the bone in order to try and make a difference. But if one person can't make a difference in a sea of what we've seen state capture did. So to summarize, it's noble to say that, yes, you're going to put up a task team, but why not work with what you have and resource them? Yeah. Give them what they need in order to be a success.
Professor Andrews, you have written a thought-provoking piece recently about the prosecuting authority needing to go after the cases that are coming out of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry with immediate effect. Before we talk about some of what you say in that thought piece, can I get your comments on what the chairperson of the commission, Justice Raymond Zondo, said, who basically criticized the NPA for its failure to deal with the cases that are coming out of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. In your view, is the NPA facing a crisis of believability in dealing with these state capture cases? And will the establishment of this task force now basically go some way to repair that in the eyes of the public?
Thank you, and good morning. Well, it's good morning here in New York. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists. I think the question is, if the crisis of credibility and their failure. I wrote a piece in 2018, even before the Zondo Commission started, when the public protector issued her report. And I wrote the piece to suggest that the NPA start prosecuting even with the limited evidence that was available, because, prosecution can be a great way, issuing an indictment can be a great way to get, to start the ball rolling, to get witnesses to talk and so on. So I think that whether they are failing, it's not a question of whether they are failing. I think they've had the opportunity in the last few years, as the evidence from the Zondo Commission has been unfolding, to actually start some prosecutions. And I think that their failure to do so does indicate that it may not be a crisis of legitimacy, but if they don't start to do so right away, as I suggest in my piece, then I think the South African public will really, really be disappointed. And their legitimacy may be questioned by the public because they now have this trove of evidence and a list of witnesses that will allow them to proceed, in a way that was far more productive 3 years ago.
Yeah. As someone who is familiar with the law, Professor Andrews, we're now getting into the nuts and bolts of your thought piece. You have stated 4 reasons for why you say prosecutions by the NPA must commence with immediate effect. Let's tackle the first reason. And you say that is because the Zondo report has provided great evidential material value to prosecutors. Question number 1, is this material court ready, or will it need further investigations?
Well, it is sort of court ready with respect to issuing indictments. It may not be court ready with respect to ultimate prosecution. If some evidence would have to be corroborated. I mean, the Commission of Inquiry was different from a courtroom. And so, yes, the evidence is court ready with respect to issuing the indictments right now and starting the process of prosecutions. But a process would still require, the court proceedings would still require the witness statements to be corroborated, the evidence and so on to be tested in court. Because if you have to show beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody is guilty, then the evidence needs to be substantiated in a way. It was substantiated by the Zondo Commission, but I think that we know that a criminal procedure and to convict somebody requires a much more corroboration of the evidence.
Advocate Simelane, let's come to you. Your question is twofold. So, Professor Andrews says the information or the material coming out of the Zondo inquiry may not be court ready, but certainly it is ready for indictments to start being issued. So, number one, have we seen enough of those indictments? Secondly, if this information still requires further investigations, I worry immediately as a member of the public and say, well, the Marikana inquiry, the Life Esidimeni inquiry also said there needs to be investigations with a view to prosecuting, but no one is sitting in jail.
Well, no one is sitting in jail because the trials have not commenced yet. It's too early for that. That is still coming. But on whether or not there are enough indictments, as you say, I don't think that should be too big a concern at this stage. I think Professor Andrews is correct about the sufficiency of information to date on what is known to be able to put together an indictment or a charge sheet by the NPA. So I think going forward, it can be reasonably expected that in the next 2 to 3 months, the NPA should be in a position to put up indictments and get the people affected thereby to appear before courts at least and get bail pending further investigations, which is the corroboration and verification processes.
Yeah.
So I'm not concerned about the ability of the NPA to commence investigations, and I don't think they're worried about that either. I think the issue is the volumes that they have to deal with, because as you are aware now, in each of the specific cases mentioned, there's thousands and thousands of documents to be poured through. Fortunately,
is the chairperson of the commission, though, I'm sorry to interrupt, is the chairperson's comments then fair on the prosecuting authority who criticizes them for their failure, I guess, to deal with these cases? In his mind, I guess some of the cases should have gone some distance.
No, absolutely. The comments are fair, and I think the public's expectations are also fair, simply because the information before the state of capture inquiry in many respects would not be new. So some of that information would have been known from the side of the police a couple of years ago. So not everything that came before the Commission of Inquiry was new. So from that perspective, what I suspect the NPA elected, in my view, quite correctly to do is to watch the proceedings and watch what was submitted there and work behind the scenes to put it all together in a manner that it would be able to use at a later stage.
Yeah.
The other advantage of the commission, of course, as you know, is that people testified under oath. And in that sense, that information is reliable and usable immediately, and not necessarily against them where they incriminate themselves, but definitely are usable against any other person. So a large chunk of the corroboration would be in the proceedings of the commission itself.
Yeah.
And those against whom their own evidence can't be used against them, to the extent that have sort of confirmed the existence, or otherwise, specifically the existence of certain activities, they've made in effect admissions. So that makes it easy from an investigation perspective, because you now know that somebody has admitted receiving something. Whether they think it was justified or not is a bit irrelevant at this stage, but at least that is not going to be now difficult going forward to prove.
Yeah.
So I think going forward, we should expect a lot of activity from that end.
All right. Advocate Stefanie Fick, let's deal with reason number 2 for why Professor Andrews feels that prosecutions should start immediately from the National Prosecuting Authority. And she says that is because evidence is fresh and easy to corroborate. Question, therefore, what are the dangers posed by unnecessary delays, which will inevitably lead to this evidence becoming stale?
I have to just refer to the fact that I think what is very unfortunate is that we had this, let's wait for the State Capture Commission to get going. I'm going to use one example. I mean, we decided to hold to account the chairperson of SAA, and she was declared a delinquent director. Even before that process started, we shared certain information. And straight after the matter, we also shared information. I think, it wasn't necessary to wait for the State Capture Commission, whose purpose was totally different than what the NPA's constitutional duty and obligation is. So they should have started. It should have been a parallel process. They should have assisted one another right from the start. I'm wondering to what extent the NPA has got access to the Gupta mails, got access to systems that made it possible for so many institutions, including the State Capture Commission, to do searches and to look at this, just the magnitude of information. And we became aware of just the Gupta mails and the server and whatever, when? In 2017 already. We are in 2022. But that being said, I mean, we need to do everything from civil society, whatever, in order to start these prosecutions. Now, yes, agreed that prosecuting, you get one chance, you get one bite at the apple. And I think it was Advocate Hofmeyr that's saying, before the state wants to prosecute, they need to make sure that, everything is in line. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. It's, the minute you become an accused, you become the holder of various constitutional rights. So it's a serious thing. So I understand, but they should have started years ago. It is their constitutional duty to prosecute, to hold to account. It is the police's duty to investigate. That is their obligation. To sit back and wait for whatever reason is now creating this situation where, and one must remember, enormous amount of evidence coming out of the State Capture Commission for state capture. Each and every day, the NPA is still responsible for prosecuting daily crimes. Yeah. That didn't stop. So it just, it's rolling and rolling and rolling, and I have to agree. The older evidence do not get better with age, like wine, like a good wine. It only gets, you get fuzzy with details. Yeah. So the sooner we start with this, the better. And that's why accused has got a right to a fair trial and he's got a right to a speedy trial. Now, although the state, to a large degree, when you get to postponements and reasons for postponements, the state has got exactly the same, right, that the longer you postpone a matter, it is not good for that case. Sure. In other words, the answer is the longer we wait, the longer or the worse the situation is going to get.
Professor Andrews, Advocate Fick touches on exactly point number 3, which you've raised in your article, and that is to say, over time, memory fades, and also equally crucial, witnesses disappear. And I want to use the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which you touch on in your article, as a perfect reference point in this regard. With FW de Klerk gone, the witnesses of that era, the apartheid era, they are disappearing fast. What could be the lesson drawn from the TRC process that this Zondo Commission process should not risk being placed under?
Yes, the lesson, I agree with Advocate Fick, excuse me, that, in time sort of memories fade, etc. And it's very important, it's imperative that the process starts, that the accused have constitutional rights. The lesson from the TRC, clearly, and there are a couple of lessons. I think the first is that the expectation that South Africans had after the report of the TRC, that those who did not appear before the TRC or who were not granted amnesty would be prosecuted, did not materialize. I think that the expectation was not met and there was great disappointment. I think similarly now, there is an expectation, especially since there are names that can be pursued and there's all this evidence and so on. They can, the prosecuting authority, despite some of the issues, the problems of the volume and so on, has also been mentioned by earlier by my colleague. So I think that is that. The third reason is that I think that South Africans my sense is there's a lot of cynicism in the country around the capability of government and the willingness of government to deal with corruption, not just large-scale corruption as has been pointed out in the Zondo Commission report, but the daily corruption that people experience when they, for example, have to deal with sections of the public service and so on. We know all of that. So I do believe that the lesson from the TRC is move against people against whom you can establish a prosecution, because it is not just about the individual, the accused, but it is about societal expectation. I think that South Africa at this point, I may be completely naive, but I do believe that if there's not movement from the prosecuting authorities on what the Zondo Commission has provided, I think South Africans, at this point, South Africans will just give up with respect to accountability. So the lesson from the TRC is establish accountability, respond to the expectations that people will be held accountable, because it's not just good for the immediate and the direct prosecution, but in fact for governance and for the sense of how citizens feel about the society and the prosecuting authorities.
When we return, we are going to bring back Advocate Simelane into the conversation and deal with the last point that Professor Andrews deals with in her article, and that is what she says is what appears to be government's commitment, at least rhetorically, to hold individuals implicated in the state capture report accountable. We're going to start on that very point when we return. You're watching Politics Unscripted, the segment of the show. It is the debate uncensored, and we're discussing the possibility or the capability of the National Prosecuting Authority dealing with the cases that will be coming out of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. As that commission wraps up its work, we know that 2 more reports, final reports, are expected, and the first one having been handed to the presidency just a few weeks, if not days ago. We are discussing this, and my guests are Stefanie Fick, and she's with the organization Undoing Tax Abuse. We're also speaking to the former NPA head, Advocate Menzi Simelane, along with the professor of law in New York, and that's Professor Penelope Andrews. Let's come to you, Advocate Simelane, and let's deal with what Professor Andrews says. It appears to be a willingness from government to commit to dealing decisively with those who have been implicated in state capture. And how she puts it is that at least rhetorically, holding individuals implicated in this report accountable, that seems to be the language from government. President Ramaphosa, at the release of this first installment of the report, the Zondo report, he said that the release of the report marks, quote unquote, a defining moment for the country, and in particular, the credibility of government. Now, if the Zondo report is left to gather dust, will that start to define and shape the legacy of President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration, in your view?
Well, firstly, I think it's highly unlikely that it will gather dust. The evidence so far in the public domain is to the contrary of that view. In fact, we mustn't forget that there are cases that have already been started that are running in courts. We don't have to deal with names, but people have made appearances. So we reasonably should expect more appearances to be made. And obviously, a presidency is never assessed, that quickly. History tends to be the one that does better judgment. But as far as the commission report itself, it certainly, in my view, will not gather dust. Mm-hmm. It is really now for the NPA to decide how it elects to approach the cases. They've got different levels of complexity, and they need to be very careful because, you don't want to start a case and later have it withdrawn or struck off the roll because you weren't such ready. I would suspect at this point that the most difficult part is getting together the witnesses, because remember, for the case to start, you must be ready to call your first witness, your second witness, your third witness, and so forth.
Yeah.
That is the most complex part. Putting a charge sheet together is not so difficult. So we need to give them enough room to be able to do that undisturbed. Fortunately, in my view, respectfully, it assists that the staff of the commission can be available to assist the lead prosecutors who will be leading the cases. For example, if you look at the evidence that was led at the commission, each of those members that did that work can firstly be contracted to actually do the prosecutions. They are familiar with the files, they're familiar with the evidence. So that can be done. I don't think it's a finance matter. If not, the NPA can quite easily bring back former prosecutors that have just retired in the past year or two, who still are fresh and have the experience to do it. So getting the resources to prosecute should not be a problem, because money is not a problem.
Yeah.
The preservation of evidence is what would be important, and getting the witnesses to talk to that evidence in a court. And most importantly, assuring those witnesses that if the issue does arise, they will be given the necessary protection, because there is a legitimate fear and a concern, and it's been there for many years, about witness protection. So that will be important.
All right.
But I'm confident.
Advocate Fick, this is a question I would like all three of you, so I'm going to come to Professor Andrews in a moment. The question around this report not being allowed to gather dust. Are you confident that this is one of those commissions of inquiry that will actually see action in this country?
I have to believe it will. I really have to, because I agree with Professor Andrews that if this report go onto a shelf, you really gonna, there's South Africans are not gonna be happy about that. This state capture did an enormous amount of damage. Corruption is evil, and we've seen the damage that just state capture did. And one would think, you know what, the marginalized, it has an impact on each and every person. Every time I'm confronted by, state capture and the fact that no real accountability happened. Accountability is extremely necessary, but what is, for me, also very important is how do we make sure that this never happens again? The South Africans lose money in the fiscus in order to look at social problems. Because of state capture, our economy is not great, so we do not create more jobs. We are not building new schools. I mean, these are the types of things that if you have corruption under control, you will have the ability to give healthcare, proper healthcare. Make sure that each and every citizen in this country has got clean water, I can go on and on and on. So it is, yes, about holding to account, but making sure it never happens. What did we see with COVID? PPE corruption. So we really need to start implementing, stop talking about it, and let's do it. We need to eradicate corruption, start building this country up again and making sure it never happens. But accountability, and although the NPA has got a duty, they have got a duty and we're looking up to them.
Yeah.
And I think as South Africans, we need to make sure that they do what they are, for a very long time are saying that they are going to do. But we also need to make sure that there's accountability in different areas. We need to start making sure that there's disciplinary action against head of departments that are not doing their job. We need to advocate for ethical leadership so that our laws in this country are just as good as the people that make sure that it's implemented and that people are held to account.
Yeah.
So I am still positive. 2022 is going to be a good year. We're going to see some people going away in orange overalls. Because if we stop believing that, it means that we have failed. And I refuse to believe that we have failed.
Professor Andrews, you are the author.
I'm going to be quick. I'm going to be quick because I want Advocate Simelane to have the last word, since he, has most experience in terms of prosecution. So I'm just going to make a few quick points. The first is that I'm not sure about prediction. I don't, I'm not on the ground and so on, and I just look at history, and history tells us that nothing will happen. So I can't make the prediction, but I think that there's enough interest. Civic societies interested, and other professional associations, individuals have an investment in this. So I think there's that. The second is that if they don't proceed, corruption will continue with impunity. And I think the lessons of impunity are very important, and that South Africans need to recognize that there's also the third point, a global audience, that investors and so on look at South Africa. And if this report, which is this part one, which is so rich with information, is not followed on, despite the obstacles again that Advocate Simelane has mentioned, then I think the global audience also is disenchanted with South Africa. And then finally, reputational. I mean, South Africa, look at the response to the death of Archbishop Tutu in the world. South Africa has always had certainly for a long time, the reputation of being, a system that people can look up to, the post-apartheid South Africa, the so-called rainbow nation. I think the reputation of South Africa has been sullied by corruption, and this is a chance to revive the reputation of the country.
Well, Professor Andrews, on that very point, let's take a break because we have yet to conclude this discussion. I read your response, especially the last response, as possibly something of a worry that we're out of time. We've still got some few minutes left, so we'll wrap up this discussion in a moment because I want to touch on what you used in that article, and that is the strategy that's been employed by the U.S. Justice Department against those who attacked the Capitol Hill. A very interesting example that was used there. Whether that might apply here, I wonder. We finalize the conversation in a moment. You're watching Politics Unscripted. We are debating the issue of whether or not the National Prosecuting Authority will be able to prosecute the cases coming out of the Zondo Commission. And some have pointed to the issues of capacity, that it has a capacity constraints issue. And with my guests now, let me bring you back into the conversation, Advocate Simelane. And I want to conclude the matter around whether or not the Zondo Commission possibly will gather dust in a shelf somewhere, and I want to use examples of the past. The TRC document, my understanding, and you'll correct me here, that document was never released by the presidents Nelson Mandela and his successor, Thabo Mbeki. Reasons, I don't think those have been given to this day, and we have used the example of that commission as to why we should worry if this report gathers dust somewhere. The Marikana Commission of Inquiry recommendations, there were recommendations of prosecutions there under President Jacob Zuma. Yes, there is a case that is in court at the moment, as I understand it, but the long and short of it is that there is nothing that seems to be moving with speed. So, case in point, no one is sitting in jail as a result of the Marikana massacre. And I could say the same for Life Esidimeni. Again, I ask the question around whether or not this report, if it is allowed to gather dust, will in part start to shape the legacy of President Cyril Ramaphosa, at least his administration.
No, it won't. I think with respect to Marikana, prosecutions did start. If you do recall, I remember the former commissioner of police in the Northwest did undergo a trial. I think he was acquitted, but he was prosecuted. So there may be an issue about whether other people should have been charged with Marikana or not. That's fine, but prosecutions did start in that particular case. With respect to Life Esidimeni, my understanding is that prosecutions will happen when they are ready. The inquest processes are still underway there. So it's not that nothing is happening. So I'm not too worried about that. Generally, government, and I think you must understand, also does not want civil disobedience. Government would not have as its intention creating an atmosphere of civil disobedience. So it will do its job. If it also doesn't, there are prospects of civil lawsuits if government is seen as not wanting to do something when it actually can, and it should, and when there's enough evidence to do so. So I don't think it will sit still. There are other tools and tactics that obviously the NPA will use in assessing its case. There are plea bargains. For example, I mean, if you look at the evidence that we have, there are people who've received gratifications already, whether it's in the form of money or cars or other physical benefits that have been demonstrated. Now, I don't see how those people can argue those things away. So their only way, I suppose, in dealing with their matters is to plea bargain an outcome that is decent, although it may still involve a custodial sentence.
Sure.
So the NPA has something to deal with there. The offer by, I think it's Business Leadership South Africa, if I recall, to assist with resources is worth taking up. Not that business will provide the prosecutors themselves, but other resources can be looked at, which can be used by the prosecution authority. So for me, really, I think the writing is on the wall. Yeah. And then if nothing does happen, you also have the prospect of private prosecutions, which will be messy, very, very, very messy. So to avoid that, government must go ahead. I think we should not be tempted to salivate with respect to individuals, if I can say that people would like to see, but look at the overall process and the credibility of the process. Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have a statute of limitations, so we do have time to run these processes, but starting them is important and pretty soon. Thank you.
Very interesting comments indeed there, Advocate Simelane. Well, Advocate Fick, touching on some of the tactical tools, as Advocate Simelane spoke about there, I want to touch on the U.S. Justice Department example that was used by Professor Andrews in her piece when she says the department went against those who attacked the Capitol Hill recently, and one of those tactics was to prosecute the easiest cases first. What would those be in the case of the State Capture Commission findings?
I think just start with some of the findings that were made in the first part. I mean, I think we're all looking forward to part 2 and part 3. And like I said, I think some of the recommendations we're really looking forward to is how can we effect change? How can we make sure that this doesn't happen again? But in terms of holding to account, I think one of the examples, and unfortunately this is or fortunately this is a case that we have been part of, is SAA. Is we have lodged, and I know it's not just us as an organization. I think there's many individuals and many other civil activist organizations that has laid criminal cases against individuals, and although they might be people that was involved in politics or whatever, it is small and easy cases, because I think there is this it happens that if you start with the smaller people or the lower down in your, if you look at organized crime, if you look at your runners and your individuals, and then you build and you move towards the bigger fish. Prosecutions in general aren't, it's actually, although, as a prosecutor, I enjoy the fact that it's you act on behalf of civil society. You act on behalf of South Africans in order to make sure that people are held to account. But it is a process. You have witnesses, and you have to make sure that everyone is in court, and then, court personnel, but it's rewarding at the end. Yeah. So you want to make sure that maybe, can we limit trials and maybe look at plea agreements, because in terms of the Criminal Procedure Act, there's always an opportunity, or making people witnesses for witnesses. In other words, you will, although you are slightly guilty, you will testify against other individuals. But most importantly, we need to start that process. Yeah. We are way behind on starting with that process.
Professor Andrews, last words from you. I'd like you to tell us how the country should deal with multinational companies, whether you talk Bain & Company, McKinsey, the auditing firms that we have all come to know. They were involved in this. How should our country deal with those multinationals? And I say this with one of them having been readmitted into the country under the fold of Business Leadership South Africa, something that has basically received widespread condemnation.
Well, I think I just wanted to refer, in answering your question, to something Advocate Simelane mentioned about, organizations aiding the NPA, and he mentioned business leadership. I did see Advocate Batoyi give a press conference in which she said that, obviously questions of conflict of interest arise, and so to get assistance from outside groups may be limited. I just wanted to raise that point, that even though in my article I had suggested the work with outside organizations, I recognize in light of her comment that, there may be questions of ethical conflicts and so on. Yeah. With respect to multinational corporations, two things. The first is that obviously the South African authorities will deal with the multinational corporations, with the officers who operate inside South Africa. But there is a way in which the prosecuting authorities and the South African government can work with foreign governments. So, for example, if those companies work in the United States Department of Justice would probably prosecute them if they were in violation of American law. And I'm sure American laws with respect to corruption are quite extensive and so on. So work with the authorities in the foreign country where they may pursue prosecutions because there's probably a violation of their own laws. If you think about what Lord Peter Hain did in the UK in trying to prevent the Guptas were trying to do some business dealings in the UK, and because Peter Hain was working with South Africans, the British Parliament, in fact, I don't know all the details, but I do recall, because it was some time ago, but the British Parliament interfered with their aspirations. So I do think that there's a strategy that can be adopted that doesn't necessarily just lay the, sort of the burden on the South African authorities. They can work with their counterparts in other countries where those multinational corporations exist. And then I can't add to what Advocate Fick said. She raised the very important points about prosecution and strategy, and starting with the relatively sort of uncomplicated cases and moving to the more complicated ones. But starting does do two things. It builds momentum. Once you start the prosecution, there's a kind of momentum that's not just within the prosecution, but in the wider society. And second, those people who are named in the report may be willing to start talking. Either willing to plea bargain or willing to serve as witnesses and so on. So it does build a kind of momentum, I think, and that's why it's important. And so, yes, with the multinational corporations, there are a couple of legal tools available to the South African prosecuting authorities, which may make their task easier when it comes to dealing with those who operate internationally as well.
Thank you all for your time. That's Professor Penelope Andrews, that's Advocate Menzi Simelane and Advocate Stefanie Fick. It has been a fruitful discussion indeed. Thanks indeed for your time.